Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Navigating Humanities and Social Sciences Consolidation in Scholarly Publishing, which is sponsored by De Gruyter. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put some links in the chat for where you can register for upcoming Choice ACRL webinars or watch previous webinars on Choice's YouTube channel. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions and comments into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And last, we sent in the reminder email for the session a link to access the PDF of the survey results, so I'll also put the link for that in the chat. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Peter Potter, Vice President of Publishing Services at De Gruyter.
Great. Thanks, Sabrina. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar, which focuses on a subject of great importance to us all, the future of scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Thanks to Sabrina and Ashley from ACRL for all the planning they put into today's event. As Sabrina said, my name is Peter Potter. Some of you may know me from my time in university press publishing, or more recently in my role as visiting program officer for ARL overseeing the TOME initiative. TOME concluded in 2022, and this summer I joined De Gruyter, where my role is to develop publishing services and partnerships. We have a splendid lineup of speakers today, all of whom I'll briefly introduce in a moment. First, I want to provide a bit of background and context for today's webinar. In part, our inspiration was Roger Schoenfeld's February Scholarly Kitchen article entitled, "Will Humanities and Social Sciences Publishing Consolidate?" If you hadn't read it, I encourage you to do so. As Roger points out in the piece, consolidation, or the flight to scale, as he calls it, has largely been completed in commercial STEM publishing through mergers and acquisitions. The obvious examples being Elsevier's purchase of Cell Press and Academic Press around the turn of the century, the Wiley-Blackwell merger in 2007, and Springer's merger with Nature in 2015, all of which has given us the large publishing houses we know today. Despite some notable exceptions, however, as Roger notes, that similar consolidation has not yet happened in HSS publishing, although he seems to believe that it is likely, if not inevitable. Roger goes on to consider the possible impact on HSS publishing should the marketplace experience further consolidation. A key driver in all of this will continue to be open access, which really has pushed this flight to scale that he refers to. And while much of the activity will be happening in the commercial space, university presses and other not-for-profit HSS publishers will certainly feel the impact too, perhaps even more so if consolidation is not a viable option for them. The question then becomes, how does HSS publishing as a whole keep up with these trends, which seem largely beyond their control? We've certainly been observing many of the same developments that Roger points to at De Gruyter, which has a unique perspective as both a publisher and a service provider. Our publisher partner program has grown as more and more presses have come to us looking for new digital revenue streams. Just this month, we announced that all 17 Canadian university presses had joined our University Press Library platform. Something significant is happening. Given these developments, we concluded that the topic was important enough that we reached out to ACRL about hosting this webinar. To seed the discussion, we developed a survey that we sent to well over 100 university presses and independent HSS publishers. The survey contained a total of 18 questions designed to assess press's perception of the current landscape. Among the questions we asked them were, how has their business changed, if at all, over the last 5 years? What do they see as the major challenges to their sustainability? How concerned are they about industry consolidation? Are they already feeling its impact? And if so, how are they responding? For instance, through outsourcing, service sharing, or seeking new revenue streams? And do they see possible opportunities in the midst of all of these changes? We received a total of 43 responses to the survey, and we'll be discussing those results today. So the larger goal for this webinar is really twofold. First, to raise awareness of the challenges facing university presses and independent HSS publishers today. And two, to facilitate discussion about those challenges and try to think collectively about what the community's response should be. Or as Roger puts it at the end of his piece, determine if some form of strategic investment or advocacy can constructively shape the HSS market before the consolidation scenario develops any further. To get the discussion going, we've assembled a panel of distinguished experts representing different parts of the scholarly publishing system. We have Peter Berkery, Executive Director of the Association of University Presses, Mary Francis, Director of the University of Pennsylvania Press, John Elwell, Senior Vice President of Books for EBSCO Information Services, Michael Zeoli, Director of Publisher Partnerships for De Gruyter. And to moderate the discussion, we're very pleased to have Richard Fisher, who is Academic and Policy Correspondent for the Independent Publishers Guild, Deputy Chairman of Yale University Press, and former Academic Managing Director of Cambridge University Press. Next up is Mike Zeoli, who will give us an overview of the survey results. After Mike, John Elwell will look at sales and pricing trends for HSS books based on data from GOBI going all the way back to 2014. And finally, we'll have our panel discussion moderated by Richard Fisher with time at the end for Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Michael, I think you're muted.
I was warned about that. Well, I'm here to present the results of a survey we did in August. Without fear or favor, I'm just presenting what the questions were and responses. We'll deal with questions stemming from this afterwards. Richard Fisher has a direct link to Elon Musk's Starlink with a taser. If I'm not done in 10 minutes, I'll be zapped. So with that, let's move right into it. So the survey profile was, it was run in August 2023. It was done with independent scholarly publishers and university presses, those that publish fewer than 500 books per year. And it covered the humanities and social sciences. We think STM is quite different. There were 43 respondents. So what is the size of your publishing house? We wanted to get a feeling for the size, even among university presses. If you take a University of Chicago or University of Toronto press, they're huge compared to, say, a Fordham University Press, et cetera. So you can see here that they were fairly evenly distributed, but those with 3 million or more in sales together were about 2/3 versus a little more than 1/3 in the smaller group. We asked what percentage of overall sales come from libraries, and in particular academic libraries. This was a very interesting response because we assume for university presses and scholarly societies, that it's going to be largely academic libraries. And in fact, 50%, right, a large group said that it was more than 50%. But beyond that, it depended on smaller percentages, which I suppose is a healthy thing to see. And what percentage of sales come from backlist? And this was also interesting. We hear when publishers talk about opening up their backlist that this would threaten their sustainability. And in fact, you can see quite a large percentage do in fact depend on those backlist sales. So as we know, switching things to open access, for example, is a complicated proposition. How has your title output changed over the past 5 years? You know, one of the analogies or a metaphor for it is trying to go up a down escalator, and that if you're not going faster than the moving stairs going up, you're going backwards. You can't stand still. We've seen quite a few publishers who are trying to maintain their level, which has been a challenge in the COVID years, or increase their output. Very few, in fact, report publishing fewer titles. And when they did, it was because of things like COVID, which affected editors and authors, as well as just simply publishing the book. What are the major challenges to your sustainability? This was spread over quite a few areas. You can see institutional funding there, which is what we hear a lot. Vendor sales models, which maybe is talked about less, but it did crop up among the top 5. The ability to increase publishing output was a challenge in terms of finding staff, the impacts of COVID, finances. What are the major opportunities to your sustainability? Increased publishing output. We've already heard that. Adjusting prices, I think we've all seen that, in particular as print shifts to digital. Adjusting subject coverage, this is a little more risky. Increasing trade titles, which I thought would be a bigger area, but it's not. And there's another category which we'll see in a minute. What areas of publishing operations do you outsource? This is kind of an old category. Publishers have always outsourced things. So editorial, production and design, not so much marketing, certainly distribution. 2 of us here on this panel are directly from that sector. What factors will drive consolidation in publishing? I think we've all seen this already quite a bit. Cost reduction and efficiency, no surprise that that's at the top. Market competition and global reach. We hear from publishers all the time trying to expand their markets. Technology, and of course, the changing funding landscape. What are the potential benefits of consolidation in the scholarly publishing ecosystem? Improve financial stability, number 1, of course. Increased accessibility to content, and the other categories. Really, it's publishers looking to benefit from efficiencies by cooperating. We see this a lot everywhere, and also expanding their visibility and their reach. How does HSS consolidation affect libraries and their ability to provide access to academic content? This was one of the more interesting ones to me. You see that blue line at the bottom, unsure, no opinion. There's a lot to say here, and I hope we'll discuss it, but it's intermediaries who are getting in the way, people like me and John. So the publishers are often detached, especially the smaller group that we're talking to, from libraries. They really don't know. What role should scholarly societies play in the context of HSS consolidation? This was interesting too. Remain independent, well, nice, but very hard for small societies. Collaborate with other societies, it's a great idea. I'm not sure that the resources are there. Unsure, no opinion. There actually are opinions that we'll see a bit later and discuss. So I wanted to summarize the challenges that we read in comments as well as saw on the slides, and then opportunities. So some of the challenges are reduced per title sales, which necessitates publishing more titles. We all know that university presses used to sell anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 copies of a title. It's now down to typically fewer than 300. The impact of journal costs on library book budgets. If we look at any of the ALA reports, you'll see the journals line going up like this and books somewhere down here. Financially viable books. It is the mission-driven presses like university presses and societies that need to publish certain scholarship that commercial publishers wouldn't touch. The capacity to maintain quality is a challenge. Staffing due to COVID and general turnover. Shrinking faculty and student enrollment, certainly a problem here in North America. Institutional funding, technology and vendor model landscape. Discoverability, visibility for smaller press content, and the decline in print sales. The opportunities, adding compatible publishers or imprints to expand the market. Ebooks, especially the shift driven by COVID. Increased channels and partnerships to increase visibility and sales. Reduce redundancies in operations and repurpose those funds. New sources of funding with new models, for example, open access, and financial stability is probably the biggest opportunity. That's all I've got. We'll talk about all this more in a minute, but first, let's hear from John with some information from GOBI. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Hey, all. I'm gonna get right into it. So I was pretty excited when I got to be asked to participate in this because I thought this would be a really fun way to cut up some data and see if we could find any trends. So thank you to Peter and the folks at AUP for providing the sales groupings. And that's really what we're looking at for the cohorting here. So you can see on the screen, group 1 is any publisher with over 196 titles. Group 2 is between 126 and 195. Group 3 is 76 to 125. Then group 4 is anyone below 75 titles. All the data we're looking at is from GOBI. It's print and digital sales across all 30-something platforms. And we looked at sales data from 2014 to current. But really, when we looked at the 14 to 19 data, very little variation, like 1% or less annually. So we're going to be focused on really the last 5 years when we're looking at this data set. To give you an idea of the scope we covered, we looked at over 900 imprints. So that wasn't annually, as there's consolidation, as publishers close or open. They fluctuate between groups based on title output. But just to give an idea, that's the scope of what we're looking. So tens and tens of thousands of titles. All the data is going to be presented in fiscal year, which for us is July through June. It's just the easiest way to pull it from the system. And really a key piece here is there's no large commercial presses included here or any trade houses. So this is all really mid-tier academics who are overwhelmingly publishing in the humanities and social science area. So let's dive right into it. So this first slide is pretty high level and just gives an overview picture of all 4 cohorts. What is their total revenue, print and digital combined, in the last 5 years? And there's 2 real things that jump out on this slide. We have a pretty consistent trend of 3 to 5% decreases in revenue for this group of publishers. Now, 21, we do see a 2% increase, but 21 is really kind of an outlier. There was a ton of additional funding. There was a ton of grant money all coming home in 21, and it's really been an outlier year overall. So if we look at this, we have 23, 22, and 20 showing downward trend in overall revenue for these publishers. The other thing we see here is the digital shift. So if we look at 19, it's almost 70-30 print. We fast forward to 23 and it's 60-40 digital. And it varies a little bit, but that's an important shift. Now, if we get into the actual cohorts, you can start to see a little more granularity. You have some cohorts like group 4 and group 2 who really shifted heavily with digital. You can see there was a 30% digital growth for both groups 4 and group 2. Someone like group 3 was much more print resilient. Group 3 is the only grouping out of here that is majority print revenue still. You can see at 55% of their revenue in FY23 is still coming via print. So keep these numbers in mind as we're going through this presentation, because this is going to come back up. So for the next few slides, what we did was we looked at cost and compared it to total revenue. And whenever I'm looking at that kind of average price, I'm looking at price to customer. That means what is actually purchased and at what price is it actually purchased at. I don't actually care what the list price is. There's a lot of noise in that. If you look at the most expensive book in GOBI right now, I want to say it's $32,000. No one buys that, right? That doesn't help us when we're looking at this. We want to know what the willingness to spend in these areas is. A couple things stand out to me here. The group 4 and group 2, the ones that were the most heavily digital in their growth, they have similar pricing strategies, it appears. There's similar differences between their print and one user pricing, and similar increases, although more heavily on group 4 for the multi-user models. The other thing that stands out is group 3. It's very flat in its digital pricing. It has a high barrier to entry with the $143 one user price, and not much variation between the multi-users, which is pretty interesting. This next slide looks at digital revenue by acquisition model. So that same slide, we just looked at pricing. Now let's look at where it distributes, right, from a revenue standpoint. And kind of surprising when I first started looking at this data is the highest priced unlimited user books were in group 4, but that accounts for 76% of group 4's revenue. And over each group, you see 3 to 2 to 1, there's a lessening of the impact of unlimited user, and there's more diversifying of the models that are required. My first guess when I saw this was availability, but when we looked at the overall availability, it was rather similar across each of the cohorts. So what is driving this? Where the most expensive content is the group 4 unlimited user, but it's overwhelmingly making up that section of group 4's revenue. I think the next couple slides get at it a bit. Excuse me. This slide looks at revenue per output. And when I'm talking about output, I'm talking about how the book's are acquired. So really I'm looking at, is this an approval output or is this a firm order? And when I say approval output, what I mean really is it something that's coming off the approval plan? So is it an auto ship, print, or ebook? Is it a notification that's leading to a purchase? Is it DDA auto populating? Things like that. So really, if you think of approval as push, right? It's being pushed to the libraries, where firm order is more they're pulling it to them. So if you're thinking of firm order, think of like an Amazon-like experience. A faculty member, a student comes into the library, requests a book, you log into the commerce portal, search the book, add book to cart, buy the book, right? So those are the two things that are juxtaposed here. And we're looking at those across e and print for each of these. And I think we start seeing some trend here that's interesting. Now, when we looked at the unlimited user model and how that percentage changed, group 4 has the largest, but here it's lowest in e-approval. And we go to 1, which is the highest. And I think this starts to make sense because you're much more likely to purchase one user titles from an approval, where it could be an auto ship or there's less mediation, right? It's almost automatic. There's less risk, there's less pricing risk to buy those lower price models. And you can see that play out there. So it's really interesting. The other thing that really stands out in this slide is right here, this 42%, which is really kind of standing out. But if we go back to slide 3, group 3 was the most print resilient, with over 55% of the revenue still being generated via print. So what we're seeing here is group 3 imprints, when imprints were being shifted from print preferred to e-preferred, they kept print preferred in place for these imprints. And you can see it play out here. And that explains kind of what was happening on that earlier slide. This is the last data slide I'm going to share, and I think it hopefully brings it all together. We talked about that approval and how there was risk with digital. If we look here, group 1 has the lowest approval pricing, and it increases incrementally for each of the subsequent groups. The other piece of this is the juxtaposition between print and digital. If we look, every single approval print is, on average, higher than the print firm orders. This makes sense. It's a pricing risk, right? Print books are cheaper. There's less fluctuation in those pricings. The risk is lower for something that's automated or less mediated. Now, if we think about it from a digital perspective, each firm order is significantly higher than the average approval ebook purchase. Again, print, it's pricing risk. And it's baked in right here where it's okay, it's the ebook, there's more risk, it's higher price, there's more fluctuation across models. And we're seeing it play out here in the trend. So I was asked to end with a couple brilliant takeaways. And unfortunately, all I have is just more questions. So I'm going to posit those here to this group, and hopefully some smarter people than I can tackle these. One question that stood out to me when doing this was, how does the transition from predominantly print acquisition to primarily digital formats affect researchers? Talked a lot about the libraries and the publishers here, but the researchers are the ones who the format differences make the biggest impact on. Be curious to explore that a little more. Got into some of the insights that could be learned from examining the correlation between pricing strategies and acquisition models and methods, but I think there's more granularity we could dive into, and I'd be interested to see additional studies in this. And lastly, I did not include any open access data in here, and that's something that I think is missing, because I do think open access, particularly when we're talking about the monograph ecosystem for HSS, is going to be a factor. So those are really the three things that stood out to me most from diving through this data. Thank you for taking a few minutes with me. I'm going to pass things over to Richard.
Hi, and thank you. Thanks, John. That's great. Hello, everybody. Good evening in Europe. Good afternoon in the States and North America. Just so everybody knows, roughly a third of the registries for this webinar were outside North America, 2/3 therein. And one of the things I was asked to do was within reason to try and globalize, or at least transatlanticize the conversation. And, remind everybody, I suppose, that the 5 imprints we're not talking about today are the 5 big ones in monographic arts, humanities, social sciences terms: Oxford, Cambridge, Taylor and Francis, Bloomsbury, and Springer Nature. And of course, particularly TNF Routledge and Bloomsbury are themselves obvious massive examples of consolidation in AHS publishing. The case of Routledge obviously being founded on a series of mergers and acquisitions in the 80s through the present day, Bloomsbury more recently. And that matters because I think, as the librarians on this call will be aware, not least in terms of where many of your dollars go, but also understanding the general dynamics of this. Because, of course, the other thing to say is that a lot of the publishers covered in the slides are not selling by any means exclusively or even largely in North America. And so their publishing strategies often are not going to be particularly determined by any one given territorial set of market constraints. So we can think about that as we go through. We've got a terrific panel. I want to straight away extend this out to now to pursue some of these really important themes. And perhaps I might start with Mary Francis first from the Penn Press. And Mary, for your take on where we are in these conversations and what your sense is as a senior industry hand of how things have been going, perhaps particularly from a kind of Penn perspective, but broadening it out.
Wow, I get to kick it off, huh? I'm glad that you mentioned those large publishers, not just Oxbridge, but also Taylor and Francis and Bloomsbury, because there was a rhetorical question earlier about consolidation and reflecting on Roger's article, which I thought was so intriguing. And are smaller mission-driven university presses feeling pressures of consolidation? And at first I was thinking, well, consolidation, because a lot of what John's slides point to, I think, is actually something more like contraction. But consolidation in the form of competition, absolutely. It is undeniable that those large publishers, particularly ones who have been playing the stock market for a long time, like Oxford or De Gruyter for that matter, have resources that smaller independent scholarly publishers do not have. And so there is always that moment of caution when you're thinking about collaboration as a form of consolidation. Like, are you going to join hands with a partner who is a lot bigger than you, and especially if they're a for-profit partner? Now, I like to talk on both sides of the street. Peter Berkery sees me in a lot of AU Press's contexts where I'm saying, watch out for those for-profit people. But here I am with my colleagues at De Gruyter, a for-profit, with whom we've got, I think, a very productive relationship. But we do also think a lot about that dynamic. We also happen to be the only Ivy League press that publishes both books and journals. So I always have my journals hat close to hand to pop it on my head. This webinar is mostly about books. But we love partnering with Muse, for example, because they are a not-for-profit. They're based at another university press, and they do a fantastic job with our journals program. So there is that sense of like, when you treat partnership as a form of consolidation, I feel like you have to think really carefully about who you're reaching out to, what their mission goal is, what their financial goal might be in accepting your offer of a partnership, or at least accepting your invitation to talk, and how will that affect you in the future. You right at the tail end of your, why don't you kick it off, Mary? Richard, you said, particularly from a Penn perspective, and I'm proud to say that the University of Pennsylvania is a place that's very, very cognizant of intellectual property issues, because they've made a lot of money off of patents and things like that. But that helps me a lot too, because there is always that question of who's in control of the future of your content, because with consolidation often comes a change in that equation about who's in control of the future of the content. And I think that that's something that we really ought to talk about more. And just to circle back to Roger's really excellent article one more time, I really would love to hear more from our society partners. There aren't any learned societies sitting here at this table, but they are often publishers. They're a very, very important part of the ecosystem. And I would say, for my money, they've felt the pinch of contraction as consolidation much more acutely, even than publishers and libraries. So I hope that for a future webinar, we might hear more from publishers based at societies, because they have that distinctive role to play in this ecosystem.
Thanks, Mary. That's great. Now, I should also have just said, anybody who wants to start firing questions into the Q&A for answering later, please do start to do so, and we will moderate those and progress. But over to Peter. Peter, longtime head of the AUP, has overseen all of this in his wise way for many years. But Peter, what's your take on some of the broader themes that Mary particularly has just articulated?
Yeah, Mary hasn't left me with very much to say, I have to say. I should begin with a small disclaimer. If you've ever served on a panel with a government official, you know that they always begin by saying that whatever they say reflects only their own views and doesn't reflect the views of the agency they work for. Yeah, so I'm just speaking, offering my own observations, as you said, Richard, from a decade in post. But unless I'm explicit about it, nothing I'm saying is AU Press's policy or an official position. A couple of, I think, important things that Mary said that I would emphasize. I think that it is, there's a definitional question here, right? What is consolidation? Project Muse has been around for how many years now? Is that a consolidation or a collaboration? In the traditional sense, in the commercial sense, I don't believe you're going to see anything looking like the M&A activity that commercial publishers have undertaken occur, except on an exceptional basis with university press. I think the last university press to be sold to a commercial entity was maybe the university, it was Iowa or Iowa State 25 years ago to Blackwell. It's the last one I can recall anyway. So there is a definitional question there, and I think our community, by its nature, tends toward collaboration. It is a very collegial group of folks, with the possible exception of acquisitions editors. They're frenemies. So I would expect to see a lot more collaboration. I'm not sure about the consolidation. I think that I also think Mary's point about consolidation versus contraction, right, is an important one. In one of John's slides, I think it was fiscal year 21, sales were actually up 5%. I suspect that the majority of my members would say that's because it was the pandemic and everybody was buying their books. But the overall contraction, I think, has to be a concern. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is there. The other thing that jumped out at me is, boy, if you look at the data from 2019 to the most recent fiscal year, the migration from P to E is real, right? We talked about it and we talked about it. It's happened clearly, and I think that just full stop needs to be acknowledged. That's what I got.
I think it's a really important point about the contraction too of the inputs. You know, Peter mentioned this in the context of the COVID, and we certainly saw this, but it's not just due to COVID. This is beyond the scope maybe of this webinar, but if you read the news across the North Atlantic, maybe a little less so in the continent, there's a shrinking group of academics who are enfranchised, so to speak, to actually spend time on research and content generation. You know, there's more precarious labor, there's more
especially long form.
Yeah, burdens being placed on more senior scholars to do service and so on rather than research and writing. And this is a huge concern, of course, to all kinds of scholarly publishers. And this is where the competition between, you know, profit and for-profit might get to be a little tough in the future, because if your job doesn't remunerate you enough for your research, you know, you're not going to produce any research. And then if you at least are enfranchised within your campus community, are you going to work with a publisher who can give you a little more outright financial support, maybe even a small advance, versus a scholar-led enterprise like a university press? I think this is a huge worry, but not necessarily one that we can cover long-term solutions for in this session, because we're not on tenure committees, unfortunately.
I think, and also I would say that the point I made earlier, the rate of contraction or the rate of shift from P to E does differ quite distinctively by continent, as it were. And, you know, publishers are exposed in Asia or in Japan or somewhere, as many, of course, of the big guns are. I mean, historically, they had sales ratios of 40% North America, 40% Europe, 20% Asia Pacific. So, you know, that was the classic canonical kind of Oxbridge, Routledge sort of ratio for global sales patterns. And they're seeing differential rates quite markedly of P to E movement, depending on where you are. And that obviously impacts publishing strategy, which is where this comes from. Bringing Mike and John into this, perhaps let's start with Mike. I mean, Mike, again, you've been watching this industry with occasional bafflement for many, many years. I'd be really interested to get your overall take on the question posed. I mean, the data is great, and I think that's a really important data set you've got there. And thanks to John too. I think that's really interesting. But, you know, from your position atop all this in some ways, what's your sense? I mean, you know, you've seen these trends come and go, and we're going to open this up to, you know, the webinar in a moment. But what's your take as you stand in 2023?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. You've done a lot of research yourself, and I would point anybody who hasn't read it. You and Michael Jube have written quite a lot on these topics. So I would recommend those, among others. And I would echo what Mary just said about faculty tenure, reduced inputs to publish. We see here the cutting of, for example, language departments. So if you take, you know, something like a translation of Homer by one of Mary's faculty at Pennsylvania, there isn't funding for that. So they go to, the ones that do have funding go to large publishers with big titles, leaving stuff that may be less financially rewarding for the presses to the commercial houses, or that is, the university presses will get the stuff that maybe has more risk and less reward. But beyond that, I look further than COVID, which certainly has actually helped publishers in the short term. If you go back 20 years, right, which is when ebooks started appearing, all those ebook aggregators appeared between 1997 and 2006. EBL, eBury, My iLibrary, NetLibrary, they're all from that period, which is shortly after the internet became a thing. Right? They've all been swallowed up. Talk about consolidation. But before they were swallowed up, they were figuring out how to cooperate with the big vendors so that they could get their books to market. A person who studied a lot of that is Colin Steele, an Australian, I think at the Australian National University.
Yeah.
But look him up and look at any of his studies, and he traces the decline of 1,500 copies of a title being sold down to 300 or fewer over that 20-year period. It's not an accident. Yeah, there's less funding, we have less enrollments, et cetera. But it's also a factor of technology, I think. So with the print book, how could you do demand-driven or patron-driven acquisitions? It didn't exist. How could you do evidence-based acquisitions? How could you do short-term rentals? None of that capability was there. The technology wasn't there. As books have moved online, the technology itself has been very disruptive in that books and information and all kinds of information competing with books has come online, like Google, Wikipedia. So
Okay.
there have been a lot of disruptive forces.
John, do you want to add anything at this stage? Then I slightly changed.
Yeah, they're really one thing is they actually have tried to do print demand driven. It just doesn't work because it's too slow. But the thing that stood out to me, and Mary kind of said it, was consolidation versus collaboration. And to me, where my head immediately went to was economies of scale. And I think that's where this industry is headed, is how do we best leverage economies of scale in our favor, right? And Michael was presenting some of the findings from the survey that showed how much was being kind of off-sourced, right, from necessarily in-house at the publisher. And I think what we'll do is we'll see more of that as we figure out better and faster and cheaper ways to do certain parts of the workflow while keeping the real IP, right, with the individual publishing houses. At least that's my hope.
The questions coming in are absolutely fabulous, by the way. Thank you, and keep them coming. I may yet exercise chair's prerogative and bring the Q&A in earlier, because there's really great questions coming in, absolutely germane to what we've already been talking about. So thank you for that. I think on that note, I mean, there was a very important point that's been made, which from within the gang, as it were, which I wanted to raise. So I would just, you know, and it's one of the questions which has come up, and it's a question for John, which came up from our gang, as it were, which is about, are you seeing any trends or differences in your data between publishers with a proprietary platform versus publishers without one? You know, platform dependencies, the role of intermediaries, Mike touched on, it's been such an issue, such an misunderstood issue. Funders and policymakers have no clue about intermediaries, in my general experience. It's always been one of the problems. But I mean, John, do you want to comment on that quickly? Then we'll go around the team, as it were.
Yeah, I can briefly comment on it. I think that when we start looking at publishers with their own platform, Diverter is one of these, their digital adoption is significantly higher. It's upwards of 80%. So when we're talking about the university press, where it's a 60-40 digital print split, for those larger houses with their own platforms, it's more like 80-20 or 75-25.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to have anything comment on that? Or should we move on to the next theme?
If I may, you know, I'm thinking of university press publishers, but also academic library consortia. So if you take the CRKN in Canada, the CRKN libraries have Scholars Portal, or Ontario does, but it's expanded to all of Canada. So they're able to work together to get content for the whole group, which is a good thing, and it may or may not be a good thing for publishers depending on their position. What the Canadian university presses have done in response to that was band together and form an organization called ACUP, the Association of Canadian University Presses, and work with that group to ensure that their content reaches maximum distribution across their libraries. A really positive outcome. You can take California Digital Library, Ohio Link, and others that have their own library consortial platform, and NYU Marley Consortium is another that comes to mind, which gives them enormous flexibility and leverage to provide content, which is good both for the publishers and the libraries.
Thank you. Mary, do you want to come in there?
Nothing to add really, except to say that it just makes good sense if you have a proprietary platform that you are going to invest in it. This is a little bit of my reflection at my time at Michigan, which a publisher within a library within a university that did embark on that adventure. And it just makes sense, right? You have to make an enormous investment. But if you're mission driven, as many of these library consortia, of course, are, it's baked in that you would want to invest in making it worth everybody's while, and to combine that mission orientation with your business investment. So I don't think anybody should be surprised by that dynamic or by the numbers that John's quick survey reflects. These are the folks who really invested, not just in, oh, how could we make things a little bit easier for ourselves, but in the platform itself, which can of course perform a lot of other functions as well.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to say?
Really, at this point, not too much that I can think of to add. I would note that, for since we're talking about platforms and infrastructure a little bit, for many in our community, academy-owned infrastructure is a key desirable. And I think since we've been talking about library consortia, I think the desire is even stronger within that group.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
I wonder, Richard, can I add? I have a question for Peter, actually.
Yeah, fire away.
Mary, you've been on the board as well. You may want to contribute here. I remember when the University Press Content Consortium was launched and looking for a platform and ended up with Project Muse. And you can maybe tell us a little bit about the origins of that. That was 20 years ago. That was, the early 2000s or mid 2000s. And almost immediately, of course, Dissent grew. And another group of university presses approached JSTOR, which had been a journals platform, and a competing model grew. So let 1,000 flowers bloom. That's a good competition. I'd be interested on any insights about that kind of cooperation and competition forming in the university press community.
Yeah, I mean, the community's evolved so much over the past 10 to 15 years. There's a part of me that wonders if that would even play out the same way today. I think to my earlier point, at the end of the day, JSTOR is, well, it's not Academy owned. It's, Ithaca's a nonprofit. It's certainly a mission-driven entity. I think probably beyond that, I should leave it to the historians to write the history of UPCC and JSTOR.
Okay, thanks. Now this is moving in interesting directions. And another question, which I think I see somebody's raised, and I was going to ask as well, is about consolidation within or around functions rather than necessarily around organizations, whether the scope for, as has often been said, one of the more general points I was going to make was that on the whole, one of the striking things about the big guns is how much more, not just percentage-wise, but absolutely they spend on sales and marketing, and in fact, of course, reaching libraries. And one of the problems for smaller imprints is often they don't have the capacity to do that kind of stuff, and therefore their knowledge of brutally how the library world works is often, let's be honest, patchy, and that is a challenge, I think, for all smaller imprints. So the question really is the scope for some sort of consolidation around a number of shared, so we say back-end services or whatever that might be, but actually still having your vibrant front end being XUP or whatever it might be. And there's been a lot of talk about that on this side of the pond as well, talking about, and how people might, and in Europe, continental Europe as well. I just would like thoughts of if there are other areas which might be right for that sort of, shared partnerships, I suppose, rather than formal consolidation. And let's perhaps start with John and go around that way this time.
I think we're seeing it in a lot of ways. And this was kind of the collaboration, economies of scale that kind of got me down that road, right? If you think of someone like Lightning Source, right? That's the ebook provider for a number of university presses, right? That's how they're disseminating their content. Longleaf, right, is doing work. There's so many instances of this where there are groups recognizing, hey, we need to do this at scale, right? We have to be able to take advantage of this. And I think that that's something that we're always talking with folks about is, hey, what is the smarter mousetrap, right? What is the better mousetrap? how do we get there quicker and easier? And usually that's better partnering with somebody, because you can get there with the larger volume.
Mary, do you want to come in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because when Steve was reviewing his slides, he had one that where the survey question asked about outsourcing certain functions, and I think, Steve, you mentioned, distribution. Well, yeah, that nobody wants to self-distribute anymore unless they're much more adventurous than I am. But a lot of I feel like there's a kind of a sliding scale, at least as a leader of a press, I feel this way. And it's sort of about the closer you get to your home base, the harder it is to outsource. And I feel like that middle space is your marketing and sales, right? As an imprint, you want to have a global footprint, you want to have global influence, and that means that ideally you have a sales skill set at your disposal, whether it's in-house or working with someone else, that can help you with that global reach, right? But so many of the university presses specifically have a regional mission function, have a campus-oriented mission function. I mean, I have so many campus partners that we work with for book series and journals, and we are certainly not alone. And then, closest to home, of course, we get way into the acquisition function. It's a faculty governance issue, right? It's your faculty board, and those are the things that there's no way you're not even going to talk about that. But I feel like that middle space is where you're trying to do those outward-facing things, where you have to somehow manage to combine your local skill set, your local familiarity, your local identity with global reach. And that can be hard to do in a way that's economically feasible. It's not impossible, but that's at least for me, that's the space that I'm thinking about a lot, because I want it both ways.
Thanks. Peter?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, at the end of the day, there's nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, as John suggested, some of these activities have been happening for years or decades, and I think Longleaf is a great example of that. And I think more recent initiatives to create electronic distribution platforms like PubPub, PubPub is Academy owned, but not University Press owned, but like Manifold and Fulcrum are good examples. But again, it's not a new idea that university presses need to collaborate to get the benefits of scale. And a great example of that is the University Press of Colorado. Colorado is a consortial press. It's not a campus-based press. It started a couple decades ago when I think maybe 10 or 12 institutions in Colorado came together and said, look, individually, we can't sustain a press. But we all need to make a commitment to scholars and scholarship. So let's create this consortium. Under the leadership of the current press director there, that consortium has grown in two ways. First of all, the number of institutions in Colorado and in the Rocky Mountain region contributing to the consortium financially has expanded. But in addition to that, as a couple of other regional university presses faced economic struggles, those presses became imprints of Colorado. So for example, Utah State and Alaska. And to Mary's point about acquisitions being core, the bit that Utah State and the bit that Alaska kept for themselves was the editorial control and the content-based decisions, and everything else happens out of Boulder. The third expansion that just occurred with respect to Colorado was the University of Wyoming decided it should step up and do its part for scholars and scholarship, but did not have the wherewithal to commit to creating its own press. So they established, rather than transferred, they established an imprint as part of the Colorado consortium. So yeah, I mean, these things have been happening and they're going to continue to happen. They need to happen so that university presses can continue to do what they do.
That's right. And of course, and again, conscious also that this isn't just a conversation about UPs. I mean, there is the significant number of my IPG friends, of small independent HNSS book publishers, many of whom are on this call, I'm happy to say, for whom the dynamics of this are slightly different, but they are related in all sorts of ways in what you might or might not try to do there going forward. I think at the fundamental point, this is not a conversation, another one about the crisis of the humanities and how that's playing out, although there are elements of that clearly. And we've been talking about enrollments and things, and I think one of the things we don't think about enough as a community is the changing nature of the graduate student community. I mean, that's another question, but I mean, the number of part-time and mature students, all that kind of stuff, which the academic press world has never found been very good at targeting in quite the ways that we used to with, if you like, traditional, that's the right word, graduate students, stuff like that is for another time. But I do think it's part of this conversation, certainly. Can I ask again, just moving on, because this is an important question, which again has been raised on the chat, and I wanted to raise too. In fact, my Viv Berghan has raised this. It's about, and it comes back to the slides, it's about consolidation of purchasing. The development of technologies like we had printed library loans, and we've got technology now advanced to a point that even well-funded libraries that might have each brought their own copy of the monograph now share one copy. Ebooks obviously tweak that to some extent, but can we use tech, the advance of tech, use AI going forward to serve libraries, but maybe in a more sustainable or resilient way, to use the argot, for imprints and publishers? And let's start with John, then Mike, and move on from there.
Sure. This kind of ties into some of what I started thinking about when Mary was talking last, and I think a good example of this is the ability to, I go back to the idea of pushing content, right? The most requested content we have is all group 4. That's what it is. But when they say add these imprints to the approval list, it's 3, 7, 10 titles annually that these imprints are publishing. And it's really in that kind of DEI core of content that we're seeing a lot more push to go find those. So really the ability to discover, find, and then present content in a way that is quick and easy, that's the hit, right? And that's where the collaboration works, because to Mary's point, maybe she has a sales staff and they can cover these certain regions well, but there's someone somewhere covering the other regions where her content's in demand. And it's finding the partnerships to be able to enable that I think is going to be how we step forward. And I think technology is the way to make those connections, right? To make sure that the content gets quickly in front of someone who can make a decision and have the right data elements in front of them to say yes or no relatively quickly, or to put the onus on the student to make that decision.
Mike?
Yeah, it's quite a problem, isn't it, that we've seen a dramatically shrinking pie for books over 20 or more years. And you wonder, can you arrest that? Can you actually grow the pie? And that's Steve Fallon, who created this partner program that I'm representing today, in part. That's his bet. Can we find a way to actually grow the pie? And so, is it hard to sell Harvard content? No. If a librarian doesn't have Harvard content, when the faculty comes looking for it, they're in trouble. Nobody wants to be in trouble. So Harvard is an easier sale, as are these premier presses like University of Pennsylvania. Not to say that, Mary, you're having parties every night about your sales, but I'm thinking about the smaller presses like University of Hawaii Press, right? Or Multilingual Matters, a small scholarly press, who publish maybe 50 books a year, a Central European University Press. When they go onto a big platform, their content is buried under, the things from the larger UPs, but more importantly, the larger trade presses or commercial houses. So they have a real problem in getting their stuff out there, never mind growing the pie. But also when you take a Penn compared to an Oxford or compared to a Taylor and Francis or Bloomsbury, how do they emerge and get libraries, to look? They want to say, hey, we're over here. We're the premier publisher in classics or philosophy or Asian studies. How do you get that attention? And one of the bets we've placed as a program, as a philosophy, is to cooperate with our partners and see if we can't actually grow the pie instead of trying to hold a place. Can can you squeeze a balloon in new ways, creative ways? So far, it's worked for us, but we'll see if it can scale. I would throw a question Mary's way about partnerships. I don't know what you can talk about or what may be still in development, but how you're partnering with other presses to help them and help you at the same time, and help library communities have more access to quality content.
Well, what can we do? You know, we're just a medium-sized press, I would say, but this is a collaboration / consolidation tactic, I would say. Peter gave some great examples of how imprints can combine, especially if it's you know, there's a regional logic, for example, to the Colorado imprint that Peter, or consortium that Peter mentioned. We have done some similar things, both with campus partnerships, where there are, you know, publishers on Penn's campus, like the Wharton School Press, that have joined forces with us. And also, you know, we are very lucky to be in Philadelphia for so many different reasons, not all of them having to do with sports or architecture or food. But that includes, you know, the cultural landscape here, the intellectual landscape here is so rich, and there are other smaller publishers. We have initiated a partnership with the American Philosophical Society, for example, which has been a publisher, not a university press, not academy based. They're a learned society since, you know, the 18th century, and we were a little stronger in certain functions. Back to this discussion of which functions can you collaborate on or outsource. And so we decided to join forces. Now, I would say that these have been beneficial to us, and I would mutually beneficial to our partners. I would caution thinking about this as if, you know, any press director at any university press could wake up tomorrow and do it, because it is, again, back to that mission orientation, very much, for me at least, about I'm a press director in Philadelphia and at Penn, and what can I do to forward the mission identity of my near neighbors? For various reasons, not every independent would have that option, but Richard was talking a little bit about the IPG folks, and maybe there's an example over there that answers your question on the other side of the Atlantic, Michael. I think it's been great, but you have to think carefully about what are the partnerships that are logical.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mary. Right, well, we're moving into the last third of this webinar now, so let's broaden it out. There's been, I say, some terrific questions on sidebar. We've already touched on a couple of them now, but the last point of John's slides, which I just want to close this section on, was about open access and about the impacts that might or might not have on what we're talking about. And one of the points that to me is most important and least thought through at the moment is the role of libraries, whether you want to call library publishers or whatever, and OA going forward. Because you look at the stats and you think libraries are being made responsible for, or wanting to take responsibility for, active or passive, something which in the past was maybe 50% their responsibility, if that makes sense, in a purely kind of financial, transactional kind of way of looking at the world. You know, that's a very rough thing, but it does strike me there are issues there we haven't quite thought through. And obviously the dynamics here in North America, the dynamics in the UK, very, very different in terms of the policy context and all that stuff, as some of you will know. Nonetheless, OA and consolidation, you know, is it actually going to drive it, or is it actually going to have potentially, in a sense, the opposite effect? I'd be very interested in what the panel. Let's start with John, because he raised the question in the first place.
That's a thorny one. So I think one of the main things with open access that has me absolutely fascinated is I don't have the data set to correlate to yet, right? Like I can look at revenue trends and sales trends and dive into all sorts of stuff and come to some sort of understanding about what is happening. I don't necessarily have that ability to do with open access yet because I don't have the tooling yet. So I think part of what's going to help drive open access adoption is as the tooling catches up. There's a number of initiatives ongoing right now. The one that jumps to mind is the Open Access Data Trust. But as new mechanisms to gather data, and from that data for us to be able to make decisions, actionable decisions. I think that's the key thing that's missing right now, that's making open access in the humanities more of a interesting conversation than something that is actually a reality at the moment.
Mary?
Wow, thorny. Does not describe it. It's from our perspective, it is such an ethically appealing outcome, open access, and in reality, such a generator of inequality, because so few scholars outside of STEM fields can actually access funds that will enable them to even contemplate this. And this is a North American perspective, of course, where, and again, more social sciences and humanities, where there just isn't the funding for the individual scholarship to make that feasible. And so I think the most successful models have been these sort of, well, let's collaborate, let's get some from the library, let's get some from the author's institution, let's get some from a granting organization. But those can be challenging for sustainability, even though they all have, I think, very smart people behind them. And we've seen some notable successes there, but it is a very tough equation, because I think there are willing partners, with the possible exception of the government in the United States, which has a fondness for mandates without funding. And I would love to see all the libraries and all the presses and all the institutions have more resources to dedicate to this, because I do think that the drive is there, the motivation is there, the mission orientation is there, but it's a little bit tough right now in North America to see that growing. Now, I think there are some exciting initiatives on the horizon, but I do think it's going to continue to be a challenge, as appealing as it is.
Thanks. Peter?
Ooh, yeah, where to even begin on such a broad topic? And I think a difficult one, because while from my perspective, open access for monographs is a pretty clear direction of travel, we're still in the early stages of the journey. John alluded to the fact that we don't have good data to make good business decisions. There's a work in progress that we hope will address that. We don't, frankly, despite a number of different experiments, including some that AU Presses has been involved directly in, we don't yet have a sustainable business model for open access. I think there's some exciting things happening right now in that regard. Path to Open is exciting. Subscribe to Open is exciting. I think those things have potential. But it's still very early days. The thing that worries me about open access is this notion that what's happened with STEM publishing, with commercial STEM journal publishing, in any way can serve as a template or a useful guide for publishing long-form humanities scholarship. I don't want to end on a down note. I mean, open access is completely consistent with the mission of a university press.
Yeah, Eric Van Ryn and John Shearer will be mad at us if we don't mention the study that they just completed, Peter. I've been trying to look for the link, and the group of folks listening to this webinar might want that link. They did do a study about how does the existence of an open access edition affect your print sales? And the news is not all bad. In fact, there's some really interesting good news in that study. And if somebody can locate a link, we should pop it into the chat, because for folks who are interested in these questions around open access, I think that is a really important perspective for us to consider and build on.
Yeah, that was actually a grant from that study was conducted under a grant from the NEH that was issued to AU Presses. John and Eric were the co-PIs. I think that the study, one of the most interesting things to me anyway about the study only tangentially relates to open access, and that's that if you look at the data, and the data set is really robust. I think one of the most useful outcomes of the study is going to be the data set, because it's out there, people can use it, and it is, as I said, robust. People who publish, or publishers who release open access titles, still manage to sell commercial ebook copies. So in fact, the winning strategy, if you look at this study, is to publish OA and to offer both P and E. That's where you achieve the optimal sales result. Yes, that is in fact it, Sabrina. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. So that's just been loaded up for those. And now in the Q&A, Richard Poinder, who many of you all know, has raised a question related to Mary's point. I think a really important one about IP. Mary raised the question of control of content in terms of consolidation. Now, if funders, as they do in Europe, if not necessarily in the States, increasingly insist on OA and the use of CC licenses, including CC BY, how does the question of control of content change? And that whole curatorial aspect has been fundamental to presses down the years, has remained so. What are the implications of that? I might, as the question is raised to Mary, I might start with Mary and then go around the room, as it were. Mary.
Well, I have to echo Peter's perspective here and just say that, I'm now going to express a very, very personal opinion, although one that I've gotten some nods from the Office of General Counsel at Penn about, is that the really wide open licenses, especially CCBY, are simply not legally sound and not sustainable from a publisher perspective. Some of the more restrictive ones are fine, and I think that they'll be important for future development in this arena. But to jump off on a point that was being made earlier about it in a different arena by Peter, you cannot use STEM as a model for humanities and social sciences publishing in all arenas. And I think particularly with respect to the questions of Creative Commons licenses, which I could talk about all day, but I promise I won't. We have to forge our own way here. And I think that the wide open licenses, particularly when mandated, can pose a lot of problems, not just for the publisher, but for the individual author as well. You need to be, go ahead with your Creative Commons license, but be careful what you choose.
Yeah, because there have been these examples, well-chronicled examples of people whose publishing then being sold for hire, profit for hire by various, legally, ostensibly legitimate organizations, but nonetheless, it's actually not what was meant at the outset.
Richard, could I just jump in here a little bit and expand on what Mary was saying? I think that the contrast to STEM here is particularly important, right? When you're a STEM researcher, your output is data, right? And you can see why a funder would want to limit the restrictions the researcher wants to put on that data. When you're a humanities scholar, your output's an idea, right? And you certainly should be able to see why the creator of that idea would want to put some restrictions on what's done with it by other people. Richard, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Do either John or Mike want to come in on this, or do you want to move on?
I can briefly just come in, and where I find it most interesting is really from the data element, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're not the content creators. We're trying to pass this along in the way that the content creators wish us to. So that the ability to communicate this to the people that need it, I think is where it gets really interesting. Right? How does that pass through the system? How does that work? And it kind of leans me back towards technology, where I think as we get better and better transmissions, right, we can do more with this more easily. That's really kind of where my head goes. Like we've done a lot of stuff now with the WAPN and all the JSTOR open access content and all the other stuff, but there's still lines to go. And kind of where I was driving the conversation is always not here yet, because we haven't been able to figure out how to fully get enough money to build out the supporting infrastructure. And I think that's the piece that I'm interested to watch play out.
Can I jump in here? So De Gruyter is not a bystander here. De Gruyter is one of the biggest OA publishers. We see this as a way of actually growing our mission with our partners. Some of our partners are huge OA publishers. Some are entirely OA, like Athabasca University Press, Concordia University Press, but of course, Central European University Press, where Francis Pinter, the founder of Knowledge Unlatched, is the chairman there. Emily Poznansky, who is in charge of De Gruyter's Open Access Initiative, is now director at Central European. We have a lot happening there and are very invested in it and see it as a future. If I could, I'd like to ask my colleague Peter Potter if he can comment. He has enormous experience directly in open access. Peter, are you there, and can you offer some insights?
Well, wasn't really ready for that, but I do think a lot of this conversation is really helpful in that I think the conversation, the larger conversation around open access often does really miss the distinction between, or the differences between STEM and HSS scholarship. And it's so much of what drives the conversation on the OA advocacy side is experience with librarians with STEM journals. And I don't think that's been fully acknowledged, and people have really kind of faced up to the implications of that. I do think that open access there are business models that can be developed that will make that work. It's just going to take time, and I don't know whether that grows the pie at all, but it certainly is. I see that as being part of the landscape for the future, and I think it will be a hybrid landscape. No matter how you look at it, it's going to be print, digital, open, closed content, and we have to learn to live with that and figure out how to build our business models around that.
I think that is hugely, I may say so, hugely right and saying as an overview of the hybrid place we're in right now. Absolutely agree. Now, conscious we've only actually got 12 minutes left. So, in some of the questions in the chat, there was a really interesting one asked by Antje from Boyd Ellenborough to start with, and it's been followed up by another colleague, by Steve from De Gruyter, about non-profit versus not non-profit, as it were. Is there a distinction that's going to become less or more relevant in the future, given the pressures, the financial pressures institutions are under? Does it matter? It's become a big issue in some contexts in the infrastructure debates we're having at the moment. We always have to remember that the American Chemical Society is a non-profit. Some of the famously most aggressive organizations in the world are ostensibly non-profits, and some of the absolute pussycats of the publishing world are nominally profitable, or sort of. So it's a good question. And of course, it does mean something different in the States to in other jurisdictions. It's always important to remember that there's a particularness about non-profit in the American context, not replicated elsewhere in the UK or in Europe. But comments, again, let's start perhaps with Peter and then go around and see what people think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to look beyond. I think you do have to look beyond the label, right? I mean, I think that I saw Vivian Burgon posted a question in the Q&A. I don't know if Lynn Reiner's on the call or not, but the academic publishers, like those good folks, right? I think in their candid moments would say, well, we're really not in this for the money, right? They're publishing largely to mission. And so I don't think you can, I think you have to look beyond the label.
Mary?
I think Peter's right. I gave myself as an example earlier of having some of my most rewarding dealings with, entities that are technically, not for profit and for profit. And it all, to me, kind of goes back to mission and what can you understand about your partner's mission And does their behavior match their rhetoric? Because as Peter P. was just saying, the behavior and the mission statement may not always be fully aligned. I will append a caution there, because as our recent provost once said to me, Mary, you're a glass half empty kind of a gal sometimes. I think with respect to intellectual property, that's where you do have to be pretty careful about the fine print, because as we all know, because we all read the newspaper and live in the world of 2023, whichever side of the Atlantic we're on, we live in a world that's designed to provide full employment for lawyers. Sorry, Peter P., but I think that's how it really is. And intellectual property is our most valuable asset aside from our talent. And so you do have to be pretty careful in that arena who you're working with and what they want when it comes to your intellectual property pie, because without that, you haven't got much. And so even if you are choosing to work with a for-profit entity, I think you just have to be careful in that specific arena, because that's so important to any publisher, whatever their status may be.
Mike, thank you very much.
Yeah, what a huge topic. I was thinking about those good publishers like Lynn Reiner and Berghahn. Boydell and Brewer, I know Anshe King had a question a little while ago. It's another where James Paul, the CEO, converted Boydell and Brewer. It was his mission into an employee-owned company. He long wanted to do that.
I have to declare so I should declare an interest. I chair the Employee Ownership Trust of Boydell, so I am actually, that's me, as it were, nowadays, but I should declare an interest in that.
Strike my comment. I never mentioned it.
Yeah.
But there's, this book, again, written by a faculty member at University of Pennsylvania, published this with W.W. Norton, another employee-owned company. But the two are very different, I think. Another part of the competition here that I think we need to keep in mind, we can't all just be friends.
Yeah, right.
We can personally, but professionally, we work for entities that are competing for that piece of pie. And we have a landscape where that drives a lot of it. So it's hard to get some things done because you can't. I'm thinking of, well, I won't mention what I'm thinking of, but we all have examples, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. Good. John.
I am lucky enough to be in a position where I get to talk to a lot of publishers and libraries, but a lot of different types of publishers. And one of the things that almost all publishers end up circling around to talk about is the idea of sustainability. And I just circle back when I think each publisher is an individual entity, right? But everyone's trying to do their best. I don't think anyone thinks that academic publishing is where people go to get rich, right? That's not the case. So I think of some for-profit presses where like, hey, if 7 people read this book, that's a huge win, because someone needed to publish this because there's some reacher somewhere that's gonna need this book someday. And then there's lots of nonprofits that think that way too. And I think that's critical. And again, back to the kind of the idea of collaboration, as long as we're doing stuff in the right ways that are highly efficient, I think people can be sustainable. So I think it absolutely matters, but I think it matters more at the individual press level than anything else.
Richard, can I make one comment there? Just these presses have a lot more to risk, so they can't, like a larger press, just jump in and try something. And when you think about the lists of presses that have been put at risk, Stanford University famously a few years ago almost cut out its press. University Press of Kentucky almost did the same thing. There was once a University of Missouri press, University Press of New England. The list is long. Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which is still with us, which is a great thing. But the risks to sustainability are very real in this group.
Yeah.
There is-
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think, you know, the points that everybody's making here, you know, like all these things, it's a balance. And it also is, I have to say again, it is different somewhat in the States to in the rest of the world. And I was asked, somebody's asked Steve, I think, was asked in the Q&A about the European perspective on these issues, which is, and the European perspective on UPs is just different in the end, as Peter knows better than anybody else, not just because Oxbridge is so different from everywhere else, but the rest of the UK is much more common, obviously, with the AUP in lots of ways. And then, of course, the continental European dynamic is very different again. If I may, I just wanted to quickly cover, there was a couple of kind of slightly more library-specific questions, which we ought to cover before we have to sign off, I'm afraid, quite shortly. Loris Olson has asked, Mike, we're your largest customer. We blocked the big university presses from our recruitment plans as we moved to De Gruyter's University Press Library, as well as CEP and AUP. Somebody's taking our money, says Loris, but how does this shift affect the numbers in your presentation?
Is this for me or for John?
Yeah, you could kick off that, Mike. Yeah.
Okay. Well, gee, I don't know if I want to give away the secret sauce here, but we have a small stable of presses that we work very closely with, and we bring them together on a regular basis with our libraries, either virtually or in person. Last week, it was in person in Boston at the Boston Public Library, which are fascinating conversations. So we tried to remove the wall separating the libraries from the publishers, and Mary Frances was there among many others. We try to be open about what we're doing, what we're all trying to achieve. One of the aspects of De Gruyter's model that's different from others is its renewability. And so, Loris, as you're purchasing those collections, and thank you very much, sincerely, the universities, including your own press, know that that's not just one book sold this time and who knows next time, but it's a commitment to the entire list from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and that it will be renewed year in, year out. And that's different. That gives the press more comfort that this is a sustainable flow of revenue, not dependent on something else. When a library commits to, as you know, Loris, to a continuing purchase, that's one of the things, it puts that sale less at risk than other purchases. I don't know if that answers the question completely.
John, do you want to come in at all on this?
Michael knows this, obviously, and we work with others at De Gruyter all the time on this, but GOBI and De Gruyter have a tight partnership. We support their platform and we support the University Press Library program. So if it takes place via GOBI or not, that's library's choice, absolutely, but it would be included in the numbers and anything I presented, yes.
Thanks. That's great. Thanks to both of you. Now, our time is nearly up, sadly. We could carry on talking about this for a while, obviously, but perhaps you might all like to think of a little closing sentence you might like to end the evening with. And wholly unfairly, I'm going to start with the senior partner in Peter to say if you'd like to kick off with any closing thoughts. Then I'll go around the room. Peter.
So two things. One is we talked a lot about growing pie today. And I have a vague recollection that a member of parliament, maybe even a minister, was recently excoriated in The Guardian for suggesting that pie can be grown. The other thing I'll say, too, is I feel duty-bound to point out that all of the presses that Michael mentioned that faced difficulty, with a caveat in the case of UPNE, all of those presses are still active, thriving members of the Association of University Presses. So when something untoward happens, we roll up our sleeves and do our jobs and try to look out for each other.
Thank you. Mary.
Michael was hallucinating. I was unfortunately not able to be at that meeting in Boston, but he did get a lot of intelligence, I'm sure, out of Clint Kimberling, my marketing and sales director. I thought this was very useful. I learned a lot from all of you, so my thanks. And I would nominate another round where we do bring in those learned societies and hear a little bit from them because they are important players and many of them are publishers. And so I'd be really interested to hear what they think of some of these issues we discussed today.
John, then Mike, quick response. John.
Kind of echoing some of what was already said, I find it fascinating every time we have these discussions, whether they're on video like they are now, or at a conference, or just in pre-chats. Every time we do, I feel like I learn something new, and I think it just goes to the industry that we're all in. Is that, to Michael said, at times you compete for stuff. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And at other times we're trying to support each other. So it's always interesting to be involved in these. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I'm from the Granite State, New Hampshire, live free or die, home of Steven Tyler. It's a tough place, you know, the hard-bitten frozen earth, 9 months of the year. Where sustainability is really important and not taken for granted. And, you know, thinking again about all the competition in this space, big presses, small presses, a world of vendors, et cetera. How do you find that sustainability? How do you find a path? And it's real. I personally have been on both sides of that. You know, there are no guarantees. We had that list of presses, but thank God they're all thriving except for one, Peter. But this sustainability issue is real, whether you're talking about open access or approval plans or whatever it might be. It's a tough world we've chosen for ourselves.
And I think, thanks, Mike. And I think that also links on to that whole question. We've sort of thought about a bit in the past about, amongst the panoply of services that presses, whether they're UPs or non-profits or smaller publishers currently provide, how many of those should they be expected to go on providing into the future? And that was a question I raised with Michael Jubb, who Mike raised earlier on in the discussion, about what are the functions that would be usefully performed in 2023 and what might not. You know, incidentally, it's been in the chat, it's been mentioned. It's a very good point that one publisher we didn't mention today, major social science publisher, is, of course, Sage, who went from being commercial, turned into, as it were, the Mary Trust, if you know what I mean, and a very interesting trajectory that they followed is a big social sciences books and journals imprint, and a slightly outlier in many ways in terms of lots of these conversations. So thanks to everybody. I hope the audience has found it interesting. I'm sorry if we haven't quite got to all of the questions, although we've got to most of them, I hope, in some form. It's very good to have your time this evening. I hope you found what people have had to say interesting and illuminating, and you at least learned something on what is now an absolutely soaking wet evening here in the Old Cambridge. So thanks very much indeed for your time and trouble, and to all the panelists, many thanks indeed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. I'll just echo you and say thanks so much to our speakers for taking the time to speak today. Thank you to Richard for moderating the discussion, and thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.